Welcome to 69 X Minutes. No, not like that. This is a news show powered by X, where citizen journalists bring you the unfiltered truth. No spin, no fabrication, just the raw pulse of the world as it's happening. I'm Erin Molan. It's great to have your company. Like everything on X, this is current, it's fast-paced, and at times maybe just a little bit cheeky. Every week we hit you with the latest headlines, deep dives from our investigative pros, and wild stories from across the globe, all straight from the X frontlines. Tonight we've got a debate on AI taking over Hollywood, a sit-down with the USAID whistleblower, a sneak peek of Mario's upcoming interview with Prime Minister Fico, a heartbreaking discussion with the former Prime Minister of Pakistan's team about Imran Khan's incarceration, and a deep dive into the activist judges gunning for Trump, Elon and Doge with AG Paxton. Foreign aid is supposed to be about helping people, but what happens when billions in taxpayer dollars disappear into the bureaucratic black holes? That's the question at the centre of a stunning expose from a USAID whistleblower. Dr. Michael Moyer, a former senior official, is pulling back the curtain on corruption and mismanagement inside the US Agency for International Development, revealing how funds meant for global development are being misused for political agendas and on wasteful projects. Could this be the biggest scandal in USAID history? We'll break down the allegations and what they might mean for US foreign policy.
I joined the Trump administration in 2018 USAID. I was a political appointee, and it took a long time for the agency to get staffed up. And one of the results of that was that the career bureaucracy basically was running things for a long time. And I eventually got put into the position of office director. And as soon as I got that job, I started receiving reports of corruption within the office. And these apparently have been allowed to go on for a long time because the career bureaucracy didn't like to police itself or call its own members out for corruption. But having joined to help drain the swamp, I went to the top officials in the agency and told them what I'd heard. And they said, well, we could do investigation. That would be probably the best thing to do. But usually that's not how it works here. Usually people just let these things go. So that was quite a disturbing discovery. I wasn't about to kind of go with the flow and let this corruption go. So I said, let's do the investigation. They did investigation. A few people got wrist slaps. One had to go to another agency, but he kept his job and stayed working for the government. That same person who had to leave got some friends of his to accuse me of publishing classified information. This was a baseless accusation for a lot of reasons. The most obvious is that I would be in jail right now if I'd actually done that. So then another friend of this guy said, well, you were accused of this by a senior person at the Defense Department, and therefore we have to take their word on it, and therefore we're going to fire you. And so that's what they did. And they convinced a few other people. I didn't realize at the time how much influence some of these senior bureaucrats have, but even some of the political appointees were intimidated by them because they knew they could also become a target. And they went after my security clearance as part of this, and that's one of the biggest ploys they will use to try to target people. Now, there's all sorts of corrupt people who never have their security clearances removed, but then they'll go after you on some baseless thing and use it against you. And so then I filed a whistleblower retaliation complaint with the Inspector General, thinking, well, at least the Inspector General must be helpful. And they turn out to be part of the whole cabal. They conducted a completely ridiculous sham investigation. And then so ultimately, I ended up trying to sue the government. There were these humanitarian assistance programs in Syria they were having to conceal because if Trump found out about them, he might want to cancel them. And of course, the last thing bureaucrats want is for their programs to get canceled. So I then reported this to higher authorities, to political appointees within the agency, but they didn't do anything with it, at least as far as I know, because they didn't fire people. I later tried contacting some of these people to get answers to why they didn't do anything, and they never told me. But I think a lot of it was these political appointees. Some of them were intimidated by the career bureaucrats, and some of them, they were there because they believed when the administration ended, they were going to get a nice job in the aid industrial complex. The senior leaders, if you look at who gets in trouble for things, they always find some very low-level person, probably not a unionized employee. People who are making decisions, they seem to be almost immune from prosecution. So I think we're going to start to see change because the power does belong to these senior bureaucrats, and so far, few of them have been held accountable.
So who has oversight authority then over USAID? Is there an internal mechanism? You mentioned there's internal affair or internal investigations, but doesn't congressional have sort of oversight component, whether some sort of review process before these contracts are awarded?
Well, there is supposed to be congressional oversight, and this is partly why you've seen Republicans not lifting a finger really to help USAID as it's under attack. There used to be bipartisan support, but we saw, especially in the last couple administrations, Democratic administrations, USAID has forcefully resisted oversight. We heard Joni Ernst went and asked for information about these overheads. They said they actually lied to her, claiming they didn't have the information. And finally, they would only let somebody go into a room and not take notes and look at something while under observation. Given what's happened, we will see this agency focused on American national interests for the remainder of the Trump administration. I'd like to say hopefully beyond. You never know what the Democrats will do when they come in. When Biden people came in last time, suddenly they were pushing all the DEI, LGBT, and climate change stuff you can think of. That didn't help them in the last elections.
What were the more egregious things that they were concealing? Was it some of because in the news, of course, we've seen reports of money going to news organizations to create news that might have been unfavorable to one candidate or another during the election cycle. You've seen money going to organizations that we may not be supporting otherwise or wanting to support. What were some of the things that they were doing that they were concealing that you found to be most egregious?
During the first Trump administration, we had great difficulty actually finding out what was going on. Now, what you're seeing with Doge going in there, they've taken full control of all the documents. And so they're starting to uncover a lot of things we could never see. Now, there are some things I will say that we were able to find out. There was a program called the Complex Crisis Fund, and it started off as $10 million. This career bureaucrat who was part of the effort to bring me down, named Rob Jenkins, he was actually lobbying with Congress directly to get them to increase this funding to $230 million. Until 2019, political appointees had no idea that this fund even existed. I found out about it because some of the career bureaucrats realized that these other bureaucrats were defrauding people. So they told me about it. I raised it to the top officials in the agency, and they said, "Oh, wow, it's been over 2 years we've been here, and we didn't even know that this existed." So that gives you an idea of just how effective they are in concealing things. In terms of things that are just outrageous, they were able to, I think, reduce a lot of things. I'd actually written an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2017 talking about some of the most ridiculous things that were going on at the end of the Obama administration, and things included, a program in Guatemala to teach people how to handle someone's ID when they don't look like the gender listed on their ID card. Or there was a women's basketball program in Somalia that was supposed to stop terrorism. Some of that stuff, I think, got eliminated. A lot of it was just rebranded. There's a case in Georgia where they were doing LGBTQ programs, and then they changed them, and they said, now these are human rights programs, so that people didn't, understand the true nature of how the taxpayer money was being spent. You saw that with climate change programs. They'll say, no, this is actually an economic growth program. And again, the first Trump administration, we were not very good. We didn't have enough people. We didn't have senior appointees who really cared enough about it. I think we're going to find out a lot more in the weeks and months ahead. They just fired the inspector general, who was a big part of the problem. And so the files there, I think, will be very telling, because another thing we know happened is they would get complaints from all sorts of people, including, some of the career bureaucrats were appalled by the corruption. And usually the inspector general would either do nothing, or they do one of these phony investigations, and nothing would happen. So I think we're going to find out that a lot of bad things happened, and no one was held accountable.
If Elon Musk and Doge sat down in front of you and said, hey, listen, we've read all the stuff you've reported on, we found all these things, is there anything we're missing? What would you tell Elon Musk and the Doge people about USAID?
I would say that they should really focus on what they find in the files from the Inspector General, which I think they may have just gotten because the Inspector General was just removed. But I think you'll find all sorts of hidden information about fraud, about waste. You'll see a lot of reports that people sat on that should have been inspected that weren't, and you'll see information about whistleblowers and the what I think will largely be fraudulent investigations. And so I think that is where a lot of the most important secrets will be buried.
From a cricket star to a political prisoner, Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan, once a symbol of populist hope, now sits in prison as his supporters claim the country's military-backed government is rigging the system to silence him. Khan has been sentenced to 14 years in jail. For what exactly? Well, that's more than a bit murky. Khan's removal from the political arena raises serious questions about democracy in Pakistan and whether the upcoming vote will be anything more than a carefully orchestrated charade. As protests erupt across the country and international pressure mounts, our reporter sat down with Imran Khan's lead advisor, who is still fighting and carrying on the movement, even from behind bars.
Imran Khan has been in prison nearly now 2 years. We're not even allowed to see him, or his lawyers can't even get access to him. He had a court case yesterday, and his lawyers weren't even given access to speak and defend him. So, he's not even getting defense. As he stands today, you can have a spot election at any time of the day, any day of the week, and Imran Khan would clean sweep that election. And I'm not just saying it as a biased worker of PTI. You can go to any independent election surveyors and others, and you can see that they've all said that there's been huge discrepancies and irregularities in the 2024 election. And PTI is by far and every day increases to be the most popular party in the country. And Imran Khan, the most popular leader the country has probably ever seen. 2 days ago, one of our MPs, his 13-year-old son, was abducted from his home. I know senators whose kids, one of them wasn't well either, was abducted. Wives, family members, mothers, houses raided, destroyed. We got 70-year-old cancer patients in hospitals. We had 13,000 people thrown into prison. Leaders were abducted, beaten, stripped naked, electrocuted, and then made to give press conferences. So there was no law of getting bail. There was no judge. No one knew where they were. They were missing from their families for months. Massive crackdown. My cousin was thrown into prison recently, and a couple of other cousins were thrown in. Bank accounts sealed, houses sealed, lands all sealed. So people, especially in the province of Punjab, people don't understand to what extent went on from stopping people from coming out. As soon as we announce something, first of all, we're not allowed to do it. So they oppose a section of the law where there's no public gathering allowed. And so then on the behest of that, what they do is that then they go and then smash people up and arrest them the night before, or 2 nights before, 3 nights before. They start arresting all of our important people. And then, so I have all my colleagues, most of them can't even go home still. And it's been about 2 years, and they're ducking from one place to another. Any major leader is not living in his home. He's living in different safe houses around the country still, after a year after the elections. So, people this is what we want. We want to raise this voice and raise these concerns internationally, because people are not understanding what is going on. I'm not allowed on television in Pakistan. Imran Khan's not allowed to be mentioned on Pakistan. Many other leaders, we're just not fathoming exactly to what extent this sort of tyranny and cruelty is going on, had happened and is going on. Women thrown into prison for no rhyme or reason. We've had about 103 or 104 civilians tried in military courts. And not only have they been tried and convicted from military courts, civilians, but even the evidence is produced against them aren't public. So still, it's all bullshit. There's nothing really going on there. They can't even produce that evidence. Like, if you've got something if we've done something against the military, which we've all condemned, including Imran Khan, that we would, no one, Imran Khan's a peaceful party. We've never done anything. It's always peaceful gatherings. That's what, Imran Khan's, he doesn't even believe in war or any form of violence. We're saying make it public. But instead, it went to a military court where everything was hidden, and now no evidence has been made public of who's been convicted. And 103 people have been convicted. kids being beaten up, why women, homes destroyed of people. If I went in there for you and you're not there and only your wife is there, I'll smash up your whole home, all your earnings, all your belongings, your cars, your everything, and you're lucky if your child is not taken away on that night. This is how everyone was living in Pakistan until this day. A lot of them are still going through this. I promise you, it's even disillusioned politicians that why are we even in this? What are we doing this for? You know, when you have your family member picked up or abducted or your house broken down, you kind of forget that why am I even here? I thought I was here to make policy, to run something, to give something back, to do something. And when you see that nothing changes, the popular leaders thrown into prison, all your rights are stripped away from you, it does disillusion you that, again, that what am I doing this for? And who am I doing this for? It's not going to go anywhere because another dictator from the military will come and sit on our head and all our rights will be taken away. So it does disillusion. But the difference between all the other times and this time, and this is where the miscalculation again came from, the 2-3 top heads and masterminds in the army, is that they never thought that someone can be this popular and will continue on getting so popular in prison, right? Imran Khan wasn't as popular as he is today 24 months ago. And Imran Khan 24 months ago was more popular than he was a year before that. The way everything has happened, he's overnight become a political monster. And every single thing they do every single day only makes him more popular. So it becomes inevitable what's going to happen with his future the minute he gets, inshallah, released. The difference between all the other previous elections in Pakistan and this election is that usually the army has always taken the side blatantly of the power or of the party that is already winning those elections. Right. The difference at this time is that they blatantly overturned and rigged the elections for the party that had clearly won. So they went against the incoming party blatantly. That is why this time the gap between the love that the people have in Pakistan for the army, and rightly so, the reason that love has deteriorated and diminished is because everyone feels that their mandate was stolen from them. That's not the case in the other elections. You might have discrepancies here and there, but not the entire country doesn't stand up in arms saying that this party didn't win the election. It was Imran Khan winning the elections. It was a question about by how much. So This is the first time they've completely gone the other way from what they're used to doing. That's why there's so much now gap and distance between the people of Pakistan and army institution. As much as we want the support, or you can say voices raised internationally for the abuses and the injustices going on in Pakistan, at the same time, you don't want to abuse those friendships or take advantage of them. So it's not like we want any involvement into our system. But more importantly, you can't just start accepting people as a norm and that it's okay when you've absolutely, annihilated the results of the elections of 250 million people. Pakistan's a huge population. It's a nuclear armed state. Terrorism has gone through the roof in the last 24 months, to the extent of it's become uncontrollable, really. Reason being that most of the attention of the establishment is basically on how to keep Imran Khan in prison rather than fighting terrorism on the borders. We had 14 people killed in the recent protests in Pakistan in November. 14 people are only those that have been reported by international media, not even local media, such as first broken by BBC and others. What we need to decide is the volume has to be more. Should it not been 14 people reported killed? Should have been 1,400 for them to be tried, or not allowed to travel freely across the world? Or is it the fact that innocent people are just being killed for peaceful protests? So these are the decisions that responsible global communities make, and that's all we're asking for. And we're just asking the world to look towards human rights abuses going on in Pakistan. Imran Khan doesn't want the Marines to jump the wall of the prison he's in and take him out and put him onto the prime minister. He just wants that the rule of law, justice systems, our judiciary, and democracy comes back into the country, which is what the country is based on. We were never a monarchy. We've been dictatorships only at the time of martial laws. Otherwise, we're a democracy, and that's all we want. I think it's important to understand that President Trump and former Prime Minister Imran Khan had a very solid and good relationship. And it'll be interesting to see, what happens in time to come. The Biden regime was very lethargic when it came towards human rights abuses in Pakistan in particular. We have a UN working group decision saying that Imran Khan is illegally in prison and should be released immediately and given compensation, and that everything was done to avoid him from contesting in the February 2024 elections. So, with all these things piled up in front of you, it's obvious what's happened in Pakistan. And at some point, human rights abuses, rule of law, democracy, these become collective responsibilities for all global leaders and countries.
Javier Milei didn't just win Argentina's presidency, he detonated a political bomb, didn't he just? The self-described anarcho-capitalist is promising to dollarize the economy, slash government spending, and take a chainsaw to the bloated bureaucracy that has left Argentina in economic ruins. Gee, sounds familiar. Markets are watching closely as Milei takes on the political establishment. But can he really deliver on his promises? We'll analyse the economic and political ripple effects of South America's most explosive leader this week.
The entire world views 2024 Argentina as an economic miracle of historic proportions. Everyone wonders how Libertarian President Javier Milei managed to chainsaw 30% of the government, not experiencing lower-class social uproar, yet increasing his popularity. Welcome to the Argentina's Milei Libertarian Miracle. In order to give you proper context, let's make a quick review. By the November 2023 presidential election, Kirchnerist Argentina was at the brink of hyperinflation. Poverty rate at more than 50%. Monthly inflation running at 25.5%. Economic default due to not honoring international debt payments. Tremendous social unrest. Discredited law enforcement. And more than 8,000 roadblocks and pickets a year. Having tried socialist/populist recipes for over a century, this time around, 56% of the population elected a libertarian as their president. By December 2023, after taking the helm of such a devastated country and having crafted a plan in advance, the first libertarian president in the history of the world was ready to turn Argentina around. Milei had campaigned on three major promises: lowering inflation, restore law enforcement, slashing public spending, his famous chainsaw. The first thing President Milei did was reducing ministries from 18 to 8 and firing over 1,000 government officials. At the same time, Milei suddenly stops money printing to finance the treasury and begins a thorough audit on public expenses. Right after that, Milei signs the famous Executive Order 70/23, abolishing rent controls, goods price controls, state funding to news media outlets, mandatory payments from employees' checks to unions, communication regulations, and countless other prohibitions. Also, Argentina announces to the world that in geopolitics it will side with the United States of America and Israel. Then, Milei instilled an anti-picketing protocol. This enabled law enforcement agencies to stop demonstrators from blocking streets and roads, securing the free movement of the people. So, with all this in place, by January 2024, after only 1 month in office, Milei had lowered monthly inflation by 5%. Yet the most important accomplishment of it all was that Argentina had reached not only primary surplus, but fiscal surplus as well, all in 1 month time. This was something the world has never seen before. After these major accomplishments, and despite getting continually scolded by the Kirchnerists, who had previously plunged Argentina into the abyss, further chainsaw policies were taken by Milei. This is when a first deregulation ministry in history was created which is eliminating an average of 3 regulations a day. More than 37,000 public employees were fired. 30% of public spending was cut. More than 12 taxes were either lowered or eliminated. A large investment incentive program with huge tax cuts was in place, and government money issuance was 100% terminated, among other things.
What happened to all that noise?
All this led to 2024 as being the biggest turnaround year in Argentine history. Poverty rate falling from 51.2% to 35.8%. This means more than 7 million souls have been lifted out of poverty. Monthly inflation falling from 25.5% to 2.2%. 12 consecutive months of fiscal surplus. Country risk falling from 2,500 to below 700 basis points. So, the question still remains. How did Milei manage to achieve all this without lower class unrest? Having audited all government agencies, which uncovered all kinds of corruption schemes, President Milei's human capital minister, Sandra Pedovello, discovered that all welfare programs' money and food were funneled through various specific NGOs. These NGOs, instead of giving the beneficiaries 100% of their duly states aid, they kept a percentage for themselves and in many cases, extorted beneficiaries. These were the infamously called managers of poverty. Being aware of this, President Milei quickly took 2 measures. 1, all welfare money would cease to be given to these NGOs and would be given directly to the beneficiaries. And 2, Milei set up a hotline for welfare beneficiaries to be able to report extortions done by these managers of poverty. By the end of 2024, more than 150,000 calls were made to this hotline. These reports showed a variety of extortions being done to the most vulnerable population for them to collect their welfare money, from having to go and block a street or a road, protesting against the government, to molesting a specific Milei's official. These managers of poverty would even reward welfare beneficiaries if they took their children to the picketing. Other uncovered extortions reported that they had to clean houses, and in the province of Chaco, one of the poorest of the country, dozens of women on welfare were coerced into having sex with local officials to collect their welfare check. This case was called the trafficking in persons welfare. Besides taking all this to court, President Milei increased welfare to cover 100% of the basic food basket. All of this combined explain the increase of Milei's popularity, but especially the reason why there is no social unrest in Argentina. After all, as Milei has always said, Argentina's demise will be paid by the caste and not by good-willed people.
The Hollywood strikes may be over, but the real war, well, that's just beginning. Studios are embracing AI at an unprecedented pace, from writing scripts to generating digital actors, raising the question, are human creatives being phased out? Alex Petrascu, a leading voice in the AI revolution, joins us to discuss the future of storytelling and whether AI-generated films could one day replace Hollywood's biggest names. Will this be a golden age of innovation or the death of entertainment as we know it?
It all started with the generative AI. But in the back of my head was like always, we must get to video at some point, right? Like it's a logical thing. Everybody was talking AI video, and then eventually early 2023 Runway came into the play, and they released their was like a video to video Gen 1, which was okay. It was like, okay, this is interesting. But when they launched Gen 2, and I was, wow.
Where do you think it goes? Do we start making movies, like full-on movies with AI?
So the first, that was the thing. The first thing that I did, I stayed for a few hours and I did like a, I don't know, AI movie. I generated with ChatGPT a script and I did a movie. And it generated like 500,000 views in like the first 12 hours. I was like, wow, people are interested in this. And I made another one, 300K views, and I made another one, 400K. It was like, oh my God, this is mind-blowing. In the beginning, I think a new category like animation was like Pixar just built on animation. People were like in shock in the 90s when Pixar came. Like, what do you mean we don't have to draw on paper? I use computers, and I was the same thing. What do you think? We don't model 3D, we generate it? I'm a big fan of technology, and I'm gonna run with it as much as possible. And yeah.
But with AI creating movies, where do you think AI's role is in that? Because is it script writing? Is it digital actors? Is it, because
all of them.
AI is essentially replicating what it's seen. So there's no soul to the creativity, right? There's no soul behind it.
There is, and there will be. That's the thing. There will be a lot of soul and a lot of creativity, because AI in the hands of a non-creative person is going to be just boring. But if you give a creative person AI, it will generate like superpowers. The glimpses we've seen lately from the new models that are coming, it's unbelievable. Like, you can imagine things that are, I don't know, you have not seen before. I don't know. It's amazing. It's addictive in the first place. You want to create, you want to do more things, because you think something and then you see it, and you see it exactly how you thought it, and it's just mind-blowing. You put it on TV, nobody will notice. Exactly. Nobody will care. It's there. But for movies and through emotion and everything, I think it's going to be a mix, and AI will be something that's going to aid a creative. I see this.
All the people in the industry. There's all of these thousands of jobs, all of these people.
There's a pyramid there, right? We have the director, the executive producer, director, all the assistants and everything. But the screenwriter, the screenplay, you name it, how many people? There's thousands of people, right? But I think, and this is going to sound awful, but I think the AI can eliminate like 2/4 like of the bottom, and so only the top creative people can remain and make a movie, and the rest, they'll have to adapt, and new jobs will be created.
What do they do? How does a graphic designer adapt to what's happening with Midjourney and with all of the now? Even Grok has a great,
I'm a graphic designer. I adapted. There are ways. I've never been more creative in my life, but I do use AI in very creative ways.
If you're a young creative person right now who wants to become a filmmaker, do you go to film school? Do you?
Yeah, I think you should. I think it should be at least to get the basics in, because a lot of people went into like, oh, now I can make AI films. Well, not really. You need to know some basic things, and I don't think you need like a full university or anything, but you need to know this is a virtual camera, right? It's nothing more than that. You need to know how to direct. You need to know how to put things together. You need to know how to edit. Right now, everybody tries to do as a one-man show, right? But it's still gonna be a collaborative process, and you do need to know the basics. So I would tell somebody, do film school, but do it in parallel with also embracing AI. And I've mentored a few guys in the past year or so, and they were in film school and they embraced AI, and you can see that. You can see the quality in their work. And there are a few guys on X who do from time to time like short films. And if you look at in their bios, filmmaker for Netflix, producer, editor, they know their craft. And that's not something that AI can learn easily. It's not going to be like, oh, do this. Because getting the right shot, even with AI, sometimes you have to adjust. And people are like, oh, you just wrote the prompt. Yeah, I wrote it like 20 times to get the perfect camera movement as I wanted and the perfect emotion. I am the one who got better as well at writing those prompts. And people do not realize how many prompts we write.
Start making movies without the whole production team.
Oh,
start building. That's the thing that's going to be the most interesting, right? That's what I think happens in the next 5 years.
Listen, I'm going to let you in on this, like behind the scenes. everyone in Hollywood wants to do with AI, but they cannot say it publicly. I'm tired how many messages I've heard from different people in the industry, in high positions or entry level or mid level or whatever, that they go like, oh man, this AI thing, I wish we could do something with it, but we don't necessarily can. I was like,
Why?
don't tell people, because they do have the regulation that they've put in place last year with SAG and all these, like they cannot come public and like, oh, AI, right? The James Cameron thing was big. I don't know. It's like, I have to admit, I'm using AI, right? Everybody's using it. There's no, and there have been discussions in more open circles in which people were like, yeah, everybody's using it. Everybody wants to use it. And now we have the Tom Hanks movie, which they come out openly, right? Using AI tools, Flux, Stable Diffusion, which they fought against them, right? So
it's coming. How do we get rid of deep fakes?
That is a very it's one of the hardest problems to solve, but we'll have to get really, really good at detecting and labeling things, maybe in the file names, maybe in the post or whatever, somehow, because otherwise things will get out of control really fast. And as good as the models get, and everything that's like, oh, this is open source. Like right now, there's many creators on X, I think you've seen, they've done ridiculous things with AI, with political figures, but you know it's AI. Today you know, tomorrow you might not know. And that is
how long before we don't know? Are we talking about weeks?
This year.
Months?
Yeah, I think it's this year.
This year
it's gonna be like it's gonna happen. And it is unfortunate, but it's up to us to figure out and inform ourselves what's real and what's not. And people will get fooled. People got fooled 5-10 years ago with deepfakes when they started appearing at the first time. Right?
It's becoming very obvious. Creative jobs are going to be gone, or they'll evolve. They're going to evolve. I do believe creative jobs are going to evolve. Like, it's very hard to replicate a human creativity. But it's going to be just the people at the top, right? Everyone else, mid entry level, it's going to be very hard to compete with AI. What's happening in media and creative areas is just the beginning. I think this happens to medicine. I think this happens in politics. I think it happens in engineering, especially, is a very important discipline. Architecture, like, we're seeing this across every industry. It's just fascinating to see it happen in yours first, because everybody said it was going to be.
I'm in for the ride, right? I honestly do think if you keep close to the technology, you are very hard to become obsolete or almost impossible. But you need to be there. All I'm saying is we have to adapt, and we have to find jobs for the people that advance humanity, not stagnate it. I always refuse to do anything that wasn't something that I loved, something that I felt here that I need to do. And it was always something creative. And eventually I did realize that this was something that I want to do. And AI just exploded this creativity inside me. And now I'm running as fast as I can. And I love it. It's been the best years of my life in like creatively and professionally.
Russia and US officials sat down to have peace talks, the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, whispers of Russia's possible return to the G7 have sparked controversy across the West. With the Ukraine war still raging, the idea of Putin rejoining the world's most powerful economic bloc seems, well, far-fetched. But is there a strategic shift happening behind closed doors? George Papadopoulos, a former Trump campaign advisor with deep ties to US-Russia diplomacy, joins us to unpack the rumours, the realpolitik, and whether the West is preparing to thaw relations with Moscow.
President Trump is really trying to see if they can achieve a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. The negotiations have started. Trump has stated that, the first possible Putin Trump summit will happen in Saudi Arabia. This bilateral meeting is kind of excluding not only our European partners and allies, but the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. So what's your initial reaction?
President Trump makes promises and he keeps promises. Ending the war in Ukraine was a massive part of his campaign promise to the American people, and I would say globally, really usher in a new era of international peace and stability, which only the U.S. president and the United States can really lead on. It was absolutely no surprise that President Trump decided to take the initiative to make the call with President Putin and to initiate discussions of how to end the war by allowing his Secretary of State Marco Rubio to start talks with Lavrov in Saudi Arabia, and the King of Saudi Arabia deciding that he would like to host this summit. I think it bodes extremely well for a new chapter in U.S.-Russia relations. Of course, there have also been discussions with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It's the Europeans who have actually been left out in the cold. President Trump has been very vocal about the Europeans having to maintain and to pay their own fair share when it comes to defense expenditure spending, to invest in Ukraine's future security, and for European troops to potentially put boots on the ground. Now, the Europeans have pushed back against many of these proposals. Therefore, it wasn't shocking that they would be left out of the initial negotiations. But I think moving forward, after the initial talks in Saudi Arabia, then the Europeans will certainly be involved later on.
What do you think the end state is? Is it the kind of a ceasefire peace treaty and that's it? Or to attempt to pull Russia out of the Chinese orbit and realign Russia against the CCP and China?
I think it's a combination of both. I was actually the member of the Trump campaign that gave the only high-level interview to Russian media, to Interfax, where the exact title of the interview was U.S. sanctions have done little more than push Russia into the arms of China. Going back to the days of Kissinger, this has been a U.S. national security question. How do you drive a wedge between Russia, back then the Soviet Union, and China? The logic of this so-called working relationship that Donald Trump wanted to have with Russia was really threefold. One, to eradicate radical Islamist terrorism, to drive this wedge between Russia and China, and third, to prevent a nuclear proliferation and a potential nuclear conflagration that would engulf the world in flames. By seeking to bring in Russia back into the West's orbit, offering the carrot of bilateral talks, potential economic cooperation, removing some sanctions, and allowing Russia to have some of their claims to Ukraine.
I think that's the problem, though, right? Because Russia's highest concentration of GRU military officials are based in Mexico, clearly directed against the United States. Russia, prior to even 2022, I mean, obviously in 2014, seized Crimea, a blatant land grab. We've seen destabilization acts that Russia has done in Georgia. We've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen in other parts of Eastern Europe. And after the invasion, we saw Finland and Sweden recognize that the primary national security threat is Russia. At what point do we see the writing on the wall where the Russians clearly indicate that the United States is their primary national security threat? At what point do we say that Russia is also a national security threat and treat them accordingly?
Cooperate where you can and confront where you must. Clearly, the United States and Russia are competitors, if not adversaries. President Trump is clear-eyed on both opportunities and the risks that are associated with dealing with Vladimir Putin. When President Trump discusses unleashing America's energy exports once again to make the United States a net exporter of energy, that directly hits Russia's state coffers, which depend on energy exports to the European market for 30 to 40% of their entire GDP. When the United States decides that they want to sell massive arms deals to countries like India, that President Trump just did with Prime Minister Modi, that also directly strikes into the Russian economy, which depends on arms exports to massive markets like India. So this notion that President Trump isn't clear-eyed of the competition that he has with Russia and Vladimir Putin is nonsensical.
What do the Russians have to sacrifice in order to achieve a peace negotiation? We really haven't heard that. You know, the Ukrainians have continued to show a desire to fight. They're still fighting. The European unions, I mean, there's probably legitimate criticisms that they haven't done enough, but they are picking up. I mean, Secretary Hegseth during the NATO conference highlighted the roles of certain European countries like Finland, like Sweden, to provide additional support. We've seen the Baltic countries do more. We're seeing Germany increase military support. So why this rush that really kind of gives a breath of fresh air to Russia that is suffering militarily and economically? Why the rush?
I think a massive segment of the GOP electorate is very weary of continuing to earmark billions and billions and billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to Ukraine to continue what looks to be not only an interminable conflict, but also a losing conflict for Ukraine. This idea that we have to continue financing this war in which hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people have already died over something that likely will end up exactly as it should have been under the Minsk agreements, which resulted in further autonomy in the East, some sort of recognition for Crimea, and an end to the war, no NATO for Ukraine.
Russia has made it abundantly clear that they will not accept any peace treaty unless the entirety of the four oblasts that they mentioned, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, are under direct Russian Federation sovereignty. So do you believe that then the solution to this is this proposal of this rare earth mineral agreement where Ukraine then provides rare earths to the United States in exchange for military support? So basically giving up the ideal of supporting a democratic country. If we're not going to fight for ideals, then for a monetary solution, and where Ukraine gives us the rare earth, do you think that will placate GOP voters?
With this deal that Zelensky has proposed with President Trump to allow U.S. foreign direct investment in regions which have not been conquered, usurped, and annexed into Russian territory, will actually allow Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength. Right now, Zelensky actually has really no leverage. By actually allowing peace to be given a chance to pause the fighting, to potentially have some sort of demarcation between the east and the west of Ukraine, and allow business to flourish, allow European capital, American capital, and potentially European or NATO troops to enter a segment of Ukraine, I think is the only way to allow Ukraine to have any path moving forward. And if the prospects do emerge much better for the western part of Ukraine, the eastern segment of Ukraine that Russia, China, or Iran might have some sort of sway or influence over will collapse from within if things go well. Because as of right now, a country cannot enter NATO in the midst of a war. So whether Zelensky or the Ukrainian population wanted to join NATO, they can't do it in the midst of a war. Peace has to be given a chance, capital has to enter, the killing has to stop, and moving forward, we could potentially see some sort of new Ukraine emerge. Likely we'll see potentially North Korea, South Korea, or even in Cyprus, which the UN right now is trying to reunify.
Let's say a treaty is signed between Russia and Ukraine. Do you believe that the United States would still be a primary economic and national security partner and even ally of the Ukraine?
I certainly think so, but I think there has to be a road to peace, or at least a road to a ceasefire, because in the current conditions, I don't think it's conducive to business. I don't think it's conducive to a bilateral relationship between the United States and Ukraine. Zelensky will only be able to negotiate from a position of strength when he's able to showcase what his strengths are. And by showing his strengths, that includes economic agreements, that includes various other bilateral agreements that he could potentially sign with the Trump administration. But to do that, there has to be a way to end this war. I think that's what Zelensky wants. I know that's what Putin wants. And certainly this has been a major campaign promise from President Trump. And that's why it's been such a priority just about 3 weeks into his administration.
Why not include the European Union and our NATO allies? I mean, they have provided support. Why not include them as part of this negotiation? It seems like we're spitting in the face of our European allies that have fought with us shoulder to shoulder since the end of the Second World War.
These peace talks that will likely be in Saudi Arabia in the next couple of weeks are the first stage of a long-term process. And then the second stage, you'll likely see European member states. Then the third stage will include countries like China, Turkey, and others. So I don't think it's spitting in the face of the European Union or NATO. I just think that this is the first step towards what will be a very long process towards an eventual peace deal.
I mean, I think there's two clear aspects that you're implying with that answer. One is that Russia will still be viewed as an adversary to the United States. And two, to ensure that there is a prosperous Ukraine, the United States will still have to have then a significant military and economic priority, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. So do you think the Trump administration post ceasefire will still prioritize Europe and Ukraine and try to show a deterrence against Russia as a threat to the European continent?
President Trump's objectives are to project power, promote energy security, and to sustain the cohesiveness of the transatlantic alliance. What better way to do all three of those than to actually force NATO members to pay more for their own defense expenditures, to actually promote further European tax dollars to go towards Ukraine, and to allow the resumption of U.S. LNG, liquefied natural gas exports from the United States to the European market. This is exactly what Trump's commitment to Europe is, has been, and will be. It wasn't a castigation against our European Union allies or our NATO allies. It was trying to make them better versions of themselves, become better partners, because right now we're looking at various different partners, and you might not even be worthy of being at the initial stages of the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. They have to figure out, do they want to develop their own European army? Do they want to coalesce together more? Or do they want to be a better version of what President Trump wants them to be, so that they are equal partners with the United States? And I think that's really what this entire redress has been all about.
We've seen kind of mixed messaging within the Trump administration. Do you believe that if there's an attempt to try to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, that the Trump administration needs to have a more coherent message?
I think the president has actually been very coherent regarding this war and regarding what he expects out of our European allies. First, let's go to Vladimir Putin. He's been very vocal, including with his Secretary of Treasury, that stated that if Russia does not go to the negotiating table and begin to end this war, we're going to hit them with much harder sanctions. This was coming directly out of President Trump's mouth. Regarding the Europeans, he has been very clear of what he expects out of them. And by being so vocal, it might be shocking to elites in Washington, D.C., or in Brussels, or London, or Moscow, or other various capitals. President Trump has been very predictable. And as somebody who's worked with him in the past, when he says something, especially at this level, he means it. And I think that's a good thing.
Judges are trying to shut down President Trump's agenda, including the actions of Doge. But Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has made it clear he's on a warpath against what he calls Soros-backed judges, who are steering the justice system towards progressive activism. With high-profile cases on the line, including election integrity and border security, the battle between state officials and activist judges is intensifying, and there's never been more at stake. AG Paxton explains exactly what activist judges are, the US war against judicial overreach, and the future of law and order if they are allowed to succeed.
The founders were pretty genius in creating the separation of powers and giving the legislative branch their authority to pass legislation, and the executive branch implementing. And then, of course, the judicial branch is designed to interpret laws. I know what the president and Elon Musk are talking about is the judiciary that doesn't just interpret the law. They actually create their own policy, their own rules, their own laws. And it's not just an interpretation anymore. Now the judiciary has stepped in the place of elected representatives and making their own decisions about what the law should be, not interpreting what the law is. The Supreme Court can only take so many cases in a year. So they get a very tiny percentage of the total cases that go up to the Court of Appeals. Everybody has a right to appeal their case to the Court of Appeals, but very few cases, a tiny, tiny percentage, actually get to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the U.S. Supreme Court cannot correct every error of law, and most of these judges on the Court of Appeals know that. So they can make errors and just take the chance that their case will not be overturned because generally they're right. I'm starting to see it a lot with some of these Democratic attorney generals filing lawsuits to stop people from being fired in the executive branch of the federal government. Well, what does the New York AG, what authority does she have to stop that? The firing by the president, who's over the executive branch, and what authority does a judge have to stop that as well? So there's lots of these cases that Democratic AGs are getting what's called standing, where they have to show that they have an injury. Injury is directly related to the action, and they're not having to show that. That's unusual. When I filed lawsuits against the Biden administration or even the Trump administration before or the Obama administration, we had to have standing. And I even thought at times we had standing and we weren't allowed in. So it's been a relatively strict standard and requirement. And somehow now standing doesn't matter if the Attorney General of New York or whatever state doesn't like what the federal government is doing. These judges are saying, yeah, stop it. Let's just stop it. That's pretty crazy. And that does pervert our system of justice, perverts our constitutional government. It's come out of decades and decades of appointing liberal judges. I mean, back to, beginning of my life in the 60s, when you had Justice Brennan and some of these others who started veering away from this idea that the Constitution and the statutes were controlled by the legislature and obviously the Constitution as we formed the nation, and that they didn't have to follow what was in the Constitution, that we had a living and breathing Constitution that they could interpret differently than what it was meant by the people who put it in place. Well, if that's true, then these judges are basically little oligarchs or a little ruling class that are not elected. They're appointed and they're there for a lifetime. And you can't do anything about them. They're just going to make up their own laws. That is not a representative democracy. That's controlled by a few people. And that's not the way our country was formed, but that's the idea. We've got these ruling elites who are smarter than us, and they're going to fix all these laws that all the dumb people in our country can't seem to get right because we elect people who are not as smart as these judges. It's a very elitist mentality, and obviously I think it's wrong. Well, let's be honest. There's certainly 1% of these judges that are not competent, not following the Constitution. They're not staying within their separated powers. Congress has to start looking at impeaching judges that are not following their role under the Constitution. If they're making up laws and it's shown, I'm not just talking about one time, two times, I'm talking about a consistent pattern of saying, I don't care what the law is, we're just going to rule this way. Or they're incompetent. I think there needs to be a look at some of these judges. We have not done that much in our history, just so they know if you're not following the law, even as a judge, there is some accountability. Why not have the Judiciary Committee of the House and the Senate go through judges and look at some of their opinions and have research done and say, okay, these judges clearly have no respect for the Constitution. They don't follow the Constitution ever. They just make up their own laws, their own rules, their own Constitution. They are a ruling class unto themselves. Well, that to me seems like it should be an impeachable offense if you refuse to do your job as is required by the U.S. Constitution. You swear to uphold it. We all do. The federal judges swear to uphold it. Every elected official I know swears to uphold it. If you're going to swear to it and then you don't do it ever, seems like a reasonable reason to take you out. There's always this tension among all branches of the government, which is what the founders envisioned, because they didn't want too much power in the hands of too few people. And so they created a tension between the branches of government, which I like. It means a lot of bad things shouldn't happen because of the tension. I would say they have the ability to affect a small number of judges, but that may be enough to send a message. Look, if you swear to uphold the Constitution, you swear you're going to do it, and you don't do it, you're not going to get to be a judge anymore. You have to at least have a minimal standard of, we'll follow the Constitution as best we can. The individual states are up to the individual states. So in Texas, we have the ability to unelect people that are not appointed. I particularly like the system of electing judges because they can be accountable to the voters. Like, we just unelected 3 statewide Court of Criminal Appeals judges in Texas, which I don't know if this ever happened, but we had 3 of the 9 up every 6 years, and we unelected 3 of them with 3 new people, because the 3 judges that we unelected were not following the Constitution. They were making up their own rules. We had a mechanism in Texas to take care of that. Other states with appointments are going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with it. But I think every state should consider, if your judges aren't doing the job, there ought to be a way to remove them. I know that our founders wanted an independent judiciary so that, they couldn't be assailed. But they also had a mechanism in the federal system, which is they could be impeached. It's just never been really done. They just sort of left them alone. They need to consider that. Now, on the state level, I am a proponent of elected judges. Is it perfect? No. Do we get 100% great judges? No. But at least then you can do something about it as voters. You can hold bad judges accountable by running somebody else and exposing the bad judges. And if it turns out that the voters agree with that, then they get to change them out. We've done it in Texas, just like I said. So, I prefer that over the appointed, because the appointed gets a lot more complicated. It's a lot harder to replace bad judges, because then you have to go through like an impeachment process or some other process that's more arduous. If you don't like elections and the risks that proceed from those elections, that somebody could be bought, then we shouldn't have a democracy at all. So my argument would be, look, is a democracy a perfect form of government? I think it was Winston Churchill who said that democracies are a terrible form of government except for all the others. So I agree with that. It is not a perfect solution. It does not govern perfectly. It has people that are in it that are bad. That's what this system is about, is trying to pull those people out. And that's what we're talking about now with judges. How do we get rid of the bad judges who will not follow the Constitution? And in my opinion, despite the fact that democracy has its glitches and you can potentially buy somebody, that's generally not what happens. And there are remedies for that. There's one related to the firing of employees, which I think is ridiculous. That is the one thing you would think that, Trump's over the executive branch, that he would be able to fire people in the executive branch. That is a big constitutional question. I mean, can the president actually do his job? I mean, if the Democrats are successful doing this, you can't fire anybody. Well, that's crazy. I mean, I would say Joe Biden can fire anybody he wants to in the executive branch, and that's his purview. He was elected. If he's elected, that responsibility falls on him. He should be able to do it. I think it's a bad precedent. I think it's a bad idea to make these arguments, but let's see how it goes. I do think you're going to have some bad decisions in some of these liberal courts, and hopefully this is one of those cases the Supreme Court will unravel and fix. The law schools are generally liberal, and most are really liberal. A lot of them don't even allow conservative thought. So there's a restriction on freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And that's unfortunate, because that's certainly not what our founders envisioned. They envisioned public education and even private education to be a free exchange of ideas on both sides, and that the better ideas would win out. But if you strangle certain ideas because you don't like them, then those ideas get put out, and you educate people only in a certain way, which is, I think the general way is, the Constitution doesn't mean anything as written. We, the smart people that are being now educated at these great law schools, we better decide that, because we're smarter than everybody else, and we're smarter than the founders. And so let us make those calls. We don't need elected representatives making decisions. Let the smart judges who are trained at these, really amazing law schools, who are smarter than the rest of the world. It's a very elitist, arrogant view, but that's the view that many of them have. The Democrats don't have a plan. And their ideas over the last 4 years were disasters, whether economically or internationally, or the border picket. It's a disaster. Hopefully the Supreme Court will at least unblock and let the executive branch do their constitutional role. And then we can have battles over individual cases involved with the administration, but at least let the executive branch do what they're supposed to, let the judicial branch interpret, not make law, and let Congress make their laws. And we can have a fight about all of this, whether they're constitutional or valid later, but at least let each branch follow their roles.
While the EU treats Putin like a pariah, and many argue that's justified, PM Fico opted for diplomacy and visited Moscow. While the EU seeks control, Fico vehemently avoids interfering in other countries' politics. While the EU attacks Elon Musk and X, PM Fico hails free speech and the escape from Soros's shackles. While the EU scrambles to get a seat on the US-Russian negotiating table, Fico criticises what he believes is the warmongering stance of the bloc for the past 3 years. Mario sat down with Slovakia's Prime Minister in this rare interview. He asked him about the state of the EU, Romania's cancelled elections, his recent meeting with Putin, US-EU relations, and surviving being shot 5 times weeks before Trump was shot. Here is a sneak peek of this exclusive interview.
We have media in Slovakia, we have NGOs in Slovakia that were paid by the USAID, and they were respecting and they were fulfilling American interests. So I'm very much happy that this institution was abolished. For a long time we knew that Slovak media, especially those that are anti-government, that have expressed themselves in an anti-Slovak way, are funded from abroad. And that's very strange, right? I wrote a letter to Mr. Musk, and I was asking him to provide to us further information about everybody who was on that list. From public sources you can get some information, but if you get more detailed information, if we could get more detailed information, that would be very nice. We would be very grateful. Entering the EU for Slovakia was something very positive. I support the EU very much. This is a peace project as well. I'm also very unhappy that it has turned now into a war project. Some of the European councils that I attended were not really meetings of the European Council. They were war cabinets. How much ammunition? How do you prolong the war? And so on. The moment you have a different opinion than the mainstream opinion, then you need to be punished. I've been the subject of this for 3 years when it comes to Ukraine. From the first day, I had a different opinion than that one single obligatory opinion of the EU. When talking about Romania, I'm really disappointed that the EU calmly respected the abolition or the cancellation of the first round of the presidential election. I was also very much disappointed regarding what happened in Georgia. The moment that somebody wins the election that's not supposed to win the election, so immediately that person is attacked, and steps are taken which are unprecedented. How can you just cancel the first round of the presidential election and then pretend that everything is okay? That's the problem of European democracy. In 2020 to 2023, when my party was in opposition, I was organizing a public protest in accordance with the law, and 5 minutes before that protest was about to start, a bunch of police officers showed up. I was arrested and I was taken to a police station so that I could not participate in that political protest. As an EU member state, we were asking the EU, please come and have a look at what's going on. People were dying while in custody, but the EU was silent. You know why? Because there was a government in Slovakia which respected the only possible obligatory political opinion, sending weapons to Ukraine. The government that was here in that period of time sent just about everything to Ukraine. Our stocks are now empty, and basically we remained naked. But the EU was happy because they had a government which was compliant in everything. At European Councils, for example, we have tried for a number of times to discuss the real military situation in Ukraine, and I was told that's not really correct to talk about what the reality of the military conflict in Ukraine is. Or I asked about corruption in Ukraine. There's a lot of money in Ukraine, and I was told that's not politically correct to talk about corruption in Ukraine. But when something happens in Slovakia, suddenly it is discussed within the EU.
You were shot 5 times, 2 months before President Trump got shot.
I was outside of Bratislava. I was going to shake some hands, which I always do. I still do it to this day. And suddenly, instead of shaking somebody's hand, I got a different gift. The wannabe assassin, he said that I had a different opinion of the war in Ukraine and so on. Plus, this is a man who is directly connected to one particular political party in Slovakia. So he's a 100% political activities. From the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, I was saying that Ukraine is misused. The West has a strategy to use the war in Ukraine to weaken Russia. That was an obvious strategy. In April 2022, there were peace agreements on the table, which Ukraine was ready to sign. But the West told it not to, because everybody believed sanctions will be introduced against Russia, and at the end of the day, Russia will lose. If you just think you can beat Russia through conventional warfare, that's not going to happen.
What do you see a peace deal look like now that EU's been excluded from the negotiations, and do you think it was the right decision for President Trump to exclude the EU from these negotiations?
EU never had its own foreign policy. The EU has always been following behind the US government. We need our own strategy, our own strategy beneficial to Europe, not a strategy which is beneficial to Washington. I'm very curious about what happens when there is an offer for peace, and if the EU find that it's not quite what they imagine, what will happen then? I think that there are a lot of surprises still in store for us, but the fact that the Americans want to negotiate with Russia first, I think that's quite normal. That's perfectly normal. This is quite responsible. We need to talk, and the EU should be helping with this process and not whine about why are we not sitting behind this table.
That's a wrap on 69X Minutes, where the news certainly is not spoon-fed, it's served raw. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and stay ahead of the spin. I'm Erin Molan, thanks for joining me. A special thanks to Mario Nawfal and the team at CJN for making this show possible and keeping the unfiltered truth alive. Until next time, keep your eyes on X because, as you know, the truth never